Hello, welcome to a video lecture that I prepared for you with my comments and concerns on your rough drafts of the profile podcast assignment. First of all, I wanted to encourage you to remember the typical problems with this essay section from the assignment sheet. And let's go over those. First one, focus. So working with more than one subject, a profile should focus on a particular subject. Writing about something other than a person, place, establishment, activity, or thing. Didn't see any problems with that. Let's see. Lack of substantial field research, which would contribute important details. I did see some kind of glossing over of the research process, and so I wanted to caution against that. And also, second from the bottom, creation of pure narrative prose, thus missing the expository nature of the profile assignment, and saw some of that. And then also watch your tone. Try not to be, engaging in this advertising or PR language. Okay, some other comments and concerns that I have. With this assignment, it's okay to use I in this paper, but be sure to keep the focus on your topic rather than on you. So sometimes when we use I too much, we kind of get into that reliance on narration, which turns this into a personal narrative, which we don't want to do. That was the first assignment. Also, it's an example of what we call author intrusion. So we don't need the author so much throughout the essay. So kind of sounds narcissistic if you're kind of the focal point the whole time. So another thing, I think I just saw this, I'm not sure in which section of 120, but I would say don't introduce new information in your conclusion. So if there's new information, then put it in the body and then have your conclusion after that. So also make sure your conclusion is worthy of your overall essay. We don't want an underdeveloped conclusion. So okay, also remember that a profile has very little to do with memories. Fresh observations are needed. And I saw some examples of people writing about things that they're overly familiar with, something that they already belonged to. So instead of extending yourself and going outside yourself and finding out something new about the world, you kind of wrote about what you already knew, and this relies too much on memories. And again, it's just not engaging in any field research, primary research to try to find things out. You already knew much of this. So also would caution you against what I call the when asked, they responded format for relating information from interviews. Again, this is an example of author intrusion, when asked. So we don't need the when asked part, but engage in writing to set up whatever the response was. So if you just have Q&A, 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 it's kind of lazy. And also, when asked, they responded. It's basically Q&A. So avoid that. Okay. And then also, I would say avoid using the term review for whatever you're profiling. Our next assignment is an evaluation analysis essay. And so one of the things is I encourage you to kind of follow a fairly standard format or structure for reviews. And so while it's kind of tempting with the profile to turn it into review, try to avoid doing that. Okay, so let me take a look at some examples from your writing and talk about those, and then come back and reemphasize my key points here. In this particular example, I think the writer has a good overall sense of this as a podcast. We see title options and some possible titles and such. But after we get into the essay part, it seems to me to be too much personal narrative. So the very first time I set foot on West Chester University's campus, so then we have kind of a transitional paragraph. This semester I had the opportunity to take an Intro to Ceramics course, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays you can find me and a couple other students, Bull Center 162, and so it's just written so much from a first person point of view that it sounds so much like the writer's individual experience and not so much like a profile essay. So we need to find a way to kind of take the author out of some of these paragraphs and focus on the class and less on the author. So, okay. So podcast structure outline, I think this is all good, and but I do have some concerns about this as being maybe too much narrative, and so I would caution the writer against that and try to limit the use of I and try not to be I so much as subject of the sentence, and instead whatever you're profiling as more the subject of the sentence. So those are my comments on this. Let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about Starbucks. And again, I think the writer has done a good job of conceptualizing this as a podcast. We have Intro to the Crunch at West Chester Podcast. And today we are discussing a certain business. And so it sounds like a podcast to me. And then we get into it after observing for a few minutes. So maybe we're kind of, no, I think we have it here in terms of an intro to the essay. And I do see insert interview, so I hope it's not just stuck in there, Q&A, 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 but try to make it more writerly by trying to talk about the topics and then have the person, respond. So, and then I do notice that it kind of shifts a little bit to first-person narrative. As I got more and more curious as to what separates, I decided to head to the student union to observe. I witnessed. I would, again, try to remove I from the subject of the sentence and instead talk about what was observed. And then we also have I decided to observe at Einstein's. So again, this is kind of exposing the reader maybe a little bit too much to your research process as personal narrative. So I ordered coffee and sat down. So in general, those are my comments, I think, about this particular essay. I think the writer is making a good attempt to use observations and other forms of field research. But right now it kind of feels a little bit like a personal narrative. So we kind of have to make the subject of the essay and not how the writer, as I concluded this observational experience, I decided. So sounds a little bit too much about the writer at this point, and let's make it more about the subject. So those are my comments on this draft. Let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about Rockwell Field, which is located on South Campus, where the women and men's varsity soccer teams practice, play, and win. So, and I think mostly this is a good draft of an essay. I think there is some room for improvement, and I think especially as we get toward the conclusion, I think this was an example of a conclusion that I thought really needed more development. So also there's some new information introduced in the conclusion, and that belongs in the body of the essay. And so again, the conclusion needs more development. Okay, so those are my comments on this draft. Let's take a look at another example. Okay, this particular essay is written about Sturzbecker Health Science Center, and I think it's a good topic for a profile essay, but I think that seems like once again we've got an example of the writer being so familiar with their topic that a lot of it depends on memories and not fresh observations. So again, sometimes we need to kind of distance ourselves from our topic and write about something that's less familiar to ourselves, but and not much else I can say at this point, so let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about Starbucks, and I think they do a good job conceptualizing this as a podcast. Welcome to Tommy's Tasty Treats podcast. Today on episode 3, season 1, talking about my experience at Starbucks. Excuse me. But after that, I think it becomes kind of too much personal narrative. When I entered, I was greeted. As I inhaled the air, I was overwhelmed. As I waited in line, I look around. So it focuses so much on the writer that I texted Allie, who referred to me, to come to Starbucks. So becomes really about kind of written in a personal narrative vein and less as a profile. And also I think toward the end we kind of fall into some PR or advertising language. So I'd caution against some of that. But those are my comments on this rough draft. Let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about Saxby's, and I think this is a really good draft. I think the writer has conceptualized it really well as a podcast, and we see it kind of outlined with music, and welcome to the Westchester Experience. Today we're talking about Saxby's, and then, so that's kind of the show intro, and then we get into the intro for the essay. I think this is a good intro. And over the summer, a new cafe opened in Westchester, Saxby's, and talking about Saxby's. And we get this intro to the essay part here. And Saxby's on South High Street. We get kind of a description here of it, which is good for kind of a review essay, and physical description, and broad menu, and kind of describing it. We also see that the writer does a good job of talking about Saxby's without making it a personal narrative essay. So where we see I in the essay, it's kind of diminished in terms of its importance as subject of the essay, and just kind of incidentally mentioned as a way of conveying the rest of the information. So I see there's going to be an interview in here, and hopefully it's not just Q&A, but and I think a good overall structure for the essay, and so I'm confident that this is well on its way to being a good audio essay or podcast. Okay, let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is profiling another student, and I thought this was a well-developed essay. It's well-developed as a podcast. Hello and welcome to another week of Interesting Individuals at WCU, the podcast that finds people worth knowing about right here at Westchester University. I'm your host, and this week we're meeting, etc. And we do have the author present quite a bit in this essay, but other than that, I think it works really well. So I think we get a good profile of Dominic as a student, and I think this is well on its way to being a good final draft and good audio essay. So let's take a look at another example. Okay, and this particular essay, the writer is writing about Sykes, and I think that the writer becomes kind of the focal point of this essay in many ways, and I would try to diminish that and make, in terms of basic sentence structure, moving I out of the subject position and talking more about the thing that you're talking about, some aspect of Sykes. And you can still use I in your essay, but let's not make it so much the focal point. So I think conceptualized well as a podcast, the podcast description, the show description, and a good opening for a podcast. Hi, and welcome back to yet another episode. And then we get into talking about Sykes, and then we get a lot of this, I decided to study what Sykes was like at different times of day. I decided I would go back to Sykes around 12 p.m. I noticed this, I noticed that. For my third trip, I went around 7 p.m. And so we're seeing it, kind of purely through the writer's viewpoint and almost to an exaggerated point. So I would cut back on some of that, talk about Sykes and less about walking your reader through your research process. Okay, so those are my comments on this essay. Let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about Barnabys, and I think this is a really well-developed draft. I think the focus is on Barnabys. The writer might say I here and there, but is not the subject of the essay, and it's not presented in a purely narrative style. So, there is some kind of, personal experience in this, but it feels like the writer is less the focal point and that the restaurant is more the focal point. So, okay, so, and add more to conclusion, I would agree with that, and make your conclusion worthy of the overall essay. But overall, I feel like this is on the right track, and looking forward to the next version of it in a audio essay format. Okay, let's talk about another example. Okay, in this particular example, I think the writer has done a really good job of conceptualizing this as a podcast. We see show intro, intro body conclusion, host outro, music outro, so just kind of an outline of it. And I think while the writer is present in this essay, the writer is not the focal point of the essay. Instead, we're talking about Dia Dolce, a cupcake place in Westchester, and good description, good insights, and I guess it's still in the process, but I think the writer is on the right track with this, and I'm looking forward to the audio version of this essay. Okay, let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about the rec center, and I think this is a good draft. We see that it's conceptualized as a podcast. Hello, welcome to the first episode of Where to Next, taking you to the rec center at Westchester University. And then we kind of feel like, now we have another intro that is the essay intro. Have you ever been to a place with over 20 different things going on inside of it at once? And very attention-grabbing introduction. And then we see things that are based on first-hand research, field research, observations and such. In the morning, you will find early weightlifters. So it's not in the on the day I observed, I saw, but the writer actually, I think, successfully shifts the perspective from the writer to the reader. So, and we get later on, around 12:04, it moves to people coming between classes, between 5 and 10. Almost every part of the rec is packed. So we see information that was derived from firsthand research and observation. As the day progresses, rec center gets more and more packed. Okay, and we do get some firsthand kind of testimony here. This is anecdotal experience. So you can write firsthand in a profile essay, but we don't want to do it for pages and pages. So this is more anecdotal evidence. It's kind of kept to a single paragraph. So, maybe this concluding paragraph needs to be broken, and that a conclusion needs to be developed out of this. We kind of have some new information going on in this, but we'll want to kind of avoid that. But overall, I think the writer is on the right track with this. So let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about Ice Rink in Westchester, and I think it's conceptualized very well as a podcast. Maybe we need to kind of separate the podcast intro from the episode intro, or the intro for the essay. Seems to kind of move back and forth a little bit in this first paragraph. But otherwise, I think succeeds very well as a profile essay. We don't see the writer, kind of taken front and center stage. It seems to be focused on the establishment instead. It is kind of a review, I think, as the writer said in the first paragraph. But some profiles kind of take on that structure. But we will definitely be doing review essays, evaluation essays with the third essay assignment. So all in all, I think this is in good shape and well on its way to becoming a good audio essay. So let's take a look at another example. Okay, this particular essay is about the rec center. And overall, I think this essay is in really good shape as a profile essay and also as a podcast. So on this week's podcast, a fitness guru, I'm taking up close and personal look at the rec center. And today I'll be talking about the many things the rec center has to offer students. So good introduction to the podcast, to the episode. There are many things that make the rec center fun. And he talks about basketball. Another cool thing is the rock climbing wall, and we talk about that. The other more popular thing, the weight room. After your workout, you can go grab a nice protein shake. So we have good topic sentences. This paragraph might need some more development, but good cohesive paragraph structure. playing sports and weightlifting not your thing, there's still activities for you to do upstairs, etc. Yoga classes. So, and then I think kind of winding it up, but I would like to see a bit more development with this essay. It's on the right track. It's coming along very well, and I think it's well on its way to being a good audio essay. So let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about Iron Hill, and I think this is a really good profile essay and conceptualized very well as a podcast. We get the podcast description, the show description, intro, outro music, the title of the show or episode, another episode of Cassidy's Cook-Off. Last week we talked about this, but this week we're talking about this, and then we get into talking about Iron Hill, and so good overview of that, and writer has a few questions. I didn't have any particular feedback on those. I think it seems to be coming along pretty well, and I trust is well on its way to being a good audio essay, and I'm looking forward to the next version of it. So let's take a look at another example. Okay, this particular profile essay, is about Saxby's, and again, I think it's looks like it's being developed very well. I see this particular draft of the essay, but I also see that the writer has an outline of the essay, and I think this is really well developed. So we get an outline, we get some notes, dominant impression, sample paragraph, and then we get to see that there's here's a link, a hyperlink to some music, lo-fi jam for about 30 seconds, and Westchester Eats is the name of the podcast, episode 7, Saxby's, and I think a good profile of Saxby's. We see small musical transition, so inserting some metatextual elements to kind of, even though it's on paper, we're thinking of it as an audio document. And the writer does say I throughout, but it's not focused on the writer. It's focused on Saxby's. So, and then we see the concluding music and some more, notes from the writer to himself and additional sections. So this seems to be well on its way, and I'm looking forward to the audio version of this essay. So those are my comments on this. Let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular example, the writer is writing about the quad, profiling the quad, and I think this is a very good profile of the quad. So good introduction. Then we get to see the quad in different times of day. We might need to break up some of these longer paragraphs into smaller paragraphs, but we see in the morning the quad is, and the afternoon, hours in the quad, etc. So again, kind of lengthy paragraphs, so I'd work on breaking those up. As the afternoon comes to a close, the evening starts, and so we see the quad at different times of day. We have an interview, so we have observations and interviews, maybe kind of distinct from each other, but they are in there. And then a conclusion here. So we just kind of need the podcast intro and the podcast outro on this, but otherwise I think this is coming along very well. Okay, let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about ice line skating rink, and again, I think this is a well-developed draft and a good profile, and I can also see it coming together as a podcast. So, kind of a bit firsthand viewpoint on this, but I think it works well in this particular situation. So, and so I don't have too much feedback on it at this point. I think it's coming along really well, and looking forward to the audio version of this. Okay, let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about the rec center, and I think this is a good draft. We see kind of the intro to the podcast here, and then the intro part of the essay, and also again, the writer, much like we saw before with another example, has shifted from I to you, and I think that works really well to involve the reader and imagine them seeing it through their eyes. When you first enter the rec center, you will need to swipe your RAM ID card, etc. Depending on when you go late at night, you can expect. So the viewpoint has shifted, and I think that makes it work really well as a profile and less as kind of a personal narrative of my research experience. So I think the conclusion needs development. I think the overall essay could use more development, but I think the writer is on the right track with this. Okay, so let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about the pods, I think, here at Westchester. Different dining options, hot coffee, tea, hot chocolates, Starbucks, Einstein's, Eco Grounds, Saxby's, and the pods. So we get a show intro to the podcast itself, and this feels like an intro to the essay itself, and it is related in first person at this point. So, kind of caution against making it too much personal narrative, but I think some of my other comments and some of the other drafts would apply here as well. So, hopefully the writer will take some of that into account. And those are my comments at this point. Let's take a look at another example. Okay, in this particular essay, the writer is writing about Tyson Hall and doing a profile on it. And I think as a profile, it's working very well. And as a podcast, it's also working very well. So we get a show description, and then we get the podcast entry, and we get the host talking, and we get a good profile of Tyson Hall. So, and I think this is well on its way to being a really good final draft, and so I didn't really have any suggestions or concerns at this point. So let me return to my lecture notes and talk about my concerns, and that's all I've got in terms of my comments on your drafts. Okay, so again, remember the typical problems with this essay section from the assignment sheet, and try to avoid those things, particularly creation of purely narrative prose, and lack of substantial field research, and writing about something that you already knew, that you were familiar with, so relying kind of on memories and not on finding out something new. Okay, also, it's okay to use I in this paper, but try to keep the focus on your topic rather than on you. Don't introduce new info in your conclusion. Make sure your conclusion is worthy of your overall essay. Remember that a profile essay has very little to do with memories, so we need these fresh observations. And avoid the when asked, they responded format for interviews. And avoid using the term review, because we're going to be dealing with that with the evaluation analysis assignment next. So those are my comments on your rough drafts of your profile assignment, and asking you to work toward an intermediate draft for next week. And by that, I want to convert this, so you might need to make some revisions to your written draft based on what I've talked about here today. But also, now let's start to move this to an audio essay. So work on anything that I addressed in this video lecture, and then also work on recording your essay, and we're going to turn it into a podcast by the end of the week. Okay, so that's all I've got. Thanks for listening, and I'll be talking to you soon.